Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are on the planet, to another episode of the WEBCON Way. This one is all about flexible business entities and task assignments. It's a tactical companion to a strategic webinar we did a couple of weeks ago on flexible organizations or adaptable organizations. This will become pretty obvious in just a matter of seconds. Specifically, you'd be surprised how many environments out there are based on faulty assumptions, or applications are based on faulty assumptions. Assumption number one, that companies work the same way everywhere. If I have multiple divisions in multiple countries, why wouldn't they be using the exact same business processes? And well, the opposite of that bad assumption would be another bad assumption, which is if I've got subsidiaries or different divisions, that they shouldn't even bother. I either want them all to use the same process, or I don't care about them using the same processes at all. I don't even want to bother to pool resources amongst them. Let Europe do what it does, let North America do what it does, let Asia Pacific do what it does. There's another faulty assumption as well, and it also involves agile organizations, so I've included it in this webinar, which is that when you assign someone a task that they're going to be able to complete it. In other words, we either expect it to be one company or a collection of completely disconnected divisions, and we expect people to always be there. And none of these things turn out to be true. In the real world, you've got different regulations and policies that apply to different parts of your organization. Even states within the US have different regulations sometimes, or different compliance requirements, let alone different countries, let alone different regions. Common resources are really valuable, especially to multi-division or multinational or even highly bureaucratic organizations, but only if they can be flexible enough to address the individual needs of different parts of an organization. Also, people go on leave, or people get reassigned, or any of a number of different things. And so it's not always possible to have a task be completed by the person that you thought it would be completed by. So we're going to do the first two of these three bullets together, and we are ending this webinar with talking about substitutions and handling leave scenarios. People also need to adjust workloads, but we'll come to that later too. All right, how about some scenarios? Scenario number one, how about a company merger? So for example, if I have two companies that merge together, what I'm probably going to start out with are two platforms, probably two different pieces of software with completely different processes, probably completely different software products. If I am really lucky, within a certain period of time, I might be able to merge the two platforms into one platform, but I'm still going to have two sets of processes because, again, say Europe and North America don't do things the same way. And for that matter, due to regulation and business culture and currencies and a million other things, they can't do things the same way. So I still have two sets of processes to deal with that. If I do better work, I might try to combine things into one platform, but that one platform is going to have a lot of conditional branching in it. But if I've got WEBCON BPS, I might be able to segue it into one very, very flexible process that accommodates things without a ton of conditional branching work. I'll show you what I'm talking about right now. How about we have a subsidiary office scenario with different reference data, different languages, different currencies, and different rules. And we're talking about task substitutions. I might have manual task substitutions. I'll tell you what, you know what I really want to do? I'm going to back up here for a minute. And in these scenarios, the company merger, we already talked about this. Subsidiary office scenario, we talked about these things. All right, how about we attack it like this? Whoops, I wanted to go back one. Nope, sorry, wanted to go back two. There. So let's deal with different reference data, different languages, different currencies, and different rules. I'm going to slide over here to this environment, and we're going to focus on a relatively simple process, and that is about dealing with expenses. So I have a European division, I have a North American division, and I want to have one standard way of dealing with expenses because we do have some centralized accounting facilities, but we really need to make it behave differently depending on whether we're operating in Europe or North America. We're going to have different reference currencies. We're going to have different people involved, all kinds of different things. Whoops, excuse me. Let's back up for a second. All right, now there are a lot of different ways you can do this. And if I really wanted to tackle everything the classic way that most platforms would have it, you would find a lot of processes that look like this. In other words, at many, many, many different points along the way, I would have branching based on what the business entity is. If it's the EU, I do one thing. If it's North America, I do something else entirely. And that could happen all over the place. Or I might wind up and just say, here's the North American version of this process. Here's the European version of this process. I will review them from time to time and try to manually keep them in sync. Well, I don't particularly love this because it requires a lot of diligence on the part of the solution developer. In fact, every solution developer. And if I make any changes to organization structure, I've got to go back and fix all of my applications. As you might suspect, given WEBCON's biases, we like to configure whenever we can so we don't have to accommodate adaptiveness within the application logic itself. But one of the things we've done is to create this thing called business entities. And some of you that have seen demos in the past might have seen a field on a lot of forms here called business entity and wondered why. Why do we bother? Well, if we only have one business entity, you don't see this field at all. In this particular organization, we've got two. And where do they come from? If you come here to system settings, right there, you'll see that there's a section here called business entities. And we can have plenty of them. I happen to have two. I have one for Europe in this particular scenario, and I have one for North America. Now, business entities are, you can think of it as a variable, or a variable that's always present in every process, except it's more than that. But it certainly starts that way. It's one attribute or a choice attribute, and we immediately give you things like, names, tax IDs, not so relevant in North America, very relevant in Europe, actually the rest of the world. Phone numbers, contact information, so on and so forth. Other attributes are quite possible. We can even vary the logo that appears on the portal depending on which business entity you belong to. We use this in a lot of places, but this is where you configure business entities. And if you do that, then essentially every time you start a new process, let me come back here and again click either new here or new here, you'll see that I have to choose which business entity it is. It is defaulting to one, and that's, well, you'll see why in just a second. Let's go back here to Designer Studio. There is a permissions box here. And what we're essentially saying here is that the North American business entity is the default for these users. And yes, of course, they can be groups. In a large organization, it's going to be a combination of Azure AD or Windows AD groups or another authentication providers groups. They could be manually chosen users. You've got lots of choices. They could be portal groups. They could be directory groups. They could be SharePoint groups, I suppose. But the main thing is this entity is the default for these users. It could be an option for some of the others. It's not. But over here in Europe, it's the default entity for these 4 people. I have cheated, not really cheated, but I've made it possible for me to choose Europe if I wish to do so. So we have 2 business entities, and that's why you see what you see the way you see it. And that's why I see a choice of business entity when I start a brand new process. Now, why would we bother with multiple business entities? Well, remember, if we go back to here, we might have different reference data, we might have different languages, we might have different currencies, and we might have different rules. Let's deal with different reference data. How about we look at it from this point of view? I might have a different threshold. For example, I will automatically approve any expense under $400 if this is happening inside of North America. However, and by the way, this would normally be looked up dynamically. I just wanted to display it on a form for dramatic effect, I suppose. But yes, anything under $400 is going to be auto-approved, and it occurs to me that's probably far too high a number for something like meals expenses or travel and entertainment type stuff. So we need to revisit editing this in a little bit. However, in North America, that's the case. The threshold is 400, and our reference currency in North America is United States dollars. Now, similarly in Europe, it's going to basically reset everything like it's a brand new form. The threshold is 500 euro. We do things a little bit differently. There also is another thing we might want to change. So in Europe, if I say that I did, let's see, I incurred an automobile expense. It was just parking. And the local amount was $10. And I was in Vancouver when I did this. So it was $10 Canadian dollars. So that amounts to €6.57, and it'll certainly be below the threshold. So this could be auto approved in theory. Let's go ahead and submit it. And that's assigned to Luke Cloudwalker, who is the proper approver for European expenses. You'll see why in just a minute. But let's go back here to new. And this one, we're going to stay in North America. The threshold is 400. And I'm going to submit more or less the exact, well, here, let's differentiate it a little bit. I'll make it on the second, just to make it easy to tell them apart later. It's an automobile expense. It's going to be parking again. Local amount will be $10 Canadian, and that's $7.36 US. And I'll click that. And this has been assigned to Alice Well to approve. So we have different approval rules. We have different thresholds. We have different calculated local amounts based on the same kind of expense. And we wound up doing that because of different rules entirely. In fact, different languages come into play as well. For example, here is a leave request scenario where I might want to either submit or approve a leave request. And so here I have instructions to me, some fields. I can choose the type of leave I want, a couple different ways of dealing with this. But I'm in North America. My default language is set to English, but there is a colleague of mine that is French, and he will hit the same place, and that actually shouldn't say leave requests. That should say something else, except that somebody forgot to translate it. But that's okay. We can fix this pretty readily. In the meantime, though, if he submits a leave request, we have this. We have everything appearing in French, including the drop-down values for lookup fields. We also have the right business entity showing up, although it's société, and so on. Everything adapts to a different language. So we understand different requirements for different business divisions under different circumstances. It's actually a pretty big deal. Now, if we're going to deal with this, let's go back. And what you're basically seeing is different branching logic. You're seeing different lookup values. You're seeing different, well, lots of things. And you're seeing automatic currency conversions to different currencies based on different business divisions. And it turns out we make all of this pretty darn easy. Let's go take a look at the facilities we bring to the table for this. Similarly with task substitutions, it's pretty easy for me to show you how we configure this, but the business scenario is not hard to grasp. I might need to manually say, you know, I'm going to be gone for a week. While I'm gone, have this person take over my tasks. I might want to be able to automate that with a workflow action. I might want that workflow action to be part of a process that we would normally do anyway, so I don't have to have a dedicated process just for assigning substitutes. Maybe if I request leave, we automatically set up a substitute for me. And what should we do when the user comes back? Should we give them their tasks back after the substitution period? And what about the substitute? Should the substitute still have the ability to see or work with the tasks after the original person has come back? All of these are things that we'll talk about in just a few moments. The features that we bring to the table to make this work when it comes to business entities, you kind of saw them already. Business entities are system objects, and they have their own security. You saw that already, but you didn't see this. Let's go back here. You saw me define who's in one business entity versus another business entity. That part's obvious. What you have not seen, however, is for me to come over to a process or an entire application and configure its privileges. So here I am under user privileges for this expense items process, and I'm seeing general settings. And in general settings, I have just said, look, the administrators are able to work with everything. But then I have these tabs that automatically appear because I have multiple business divisions or business entities. So in North America, I am going to allow these people to launch new workflow instances, start new instances in the process. If it's a European business entity, we will allow these people to do it. So I have the ability to segment privileges on the same application and have that be conditional based on where in the organization you are. And if you're saying to yourself, well, we only have one location, that's fine, but you might have different divisions or different departments or different groups, and you still might want to treat them differently. I'm using geography as a reason to split the organization into different entities, but in your case, it might be any of a number of things. Oh, here, in a large financial organization, you might have auditors and investors very carefully separated so that they can't see what each other is doing. In fact, it's a legal requirement under most countries' laws that auditing activity and investment activity do not cross paths. So that would be a reason to keep things separate. But they both have expenses that need to be turned in. And but who's going to be doing the privileges and a whole bunch of other things? They're just very, very different. Rather than having lots of different individual processes, you can have one smart process that just adapts. So thing number one that I did here was I separated the privileges. Now, we can continue to be smart about this. We did security. Now let's deal with path branching based on where you are in the organization. Now, the obvious way or convenient way to deal with this, I suppose, would be to do something like this. Interrupt the process and check to see what the business entity is and do different things. So let's open this up. The current business entity is an attribute that you can work with. Let's click here on the ellipsis and go to the rule editor. I see connected business entities. You'll find that under system fields. There it is. And so the current business entity, all of the attributes for it, the name, the code, all those things that we edited on the other page, they show up here. And you can make use of them within your processes. Those fields are always available to you. I've seen some people throw JSON or XML inside of the description field and then use a rule formula to parse it to pluck custom values out of there. You've got a lot of choices, but really all I wanted here was the code. And so it's either going to be NA or EU. And so I follow one path or another path. And then if I am following the EU path, I assign it to the reviewers for the EU group. If I am following the North American path, I assign it to the North American reviewers group. And then we go back here to the same review step and continue along the path accordingly. Now, I don't hate this. In fact, this is handy, and I might need to do this quite often, but I don't need to do it here. There's actually an easier way for us to handle this. It's based on the fact that we support multiple business entities and the fact that we support the notion of tokens. So what I have is a number of different groups that have been defined. And what I have is a very powerful business rule facility for deciding who's allowed to be assigned to what. So what I have done is made just a simple SQL statement, and it didn't have to be SQL. It was just really convenient to select an assembled string with a replacement token in a matter of seconds. I could have done this in JavaScript. I even could have done this, I suppose, with just building something in a rule. But it was just fastest for me to do this in a single line. So all I did is I know that there's a group named reviewers, NA, and another group named reviewers, EU. So what I did is I selected reviewers, and then I substitute in the code for the business entity in the middle of that and bring it back as a single value. So this will resolve, every running process runs under a business entity. So whatever that is going to be inserted here. So this is going to return reviewers EU or reviewers NA. And it'll be dynamically assigned to that. And that's why you saw, and this is the one we actually use. That one the other one, I just did to illustrate. This is the one you saw work a moment ago. And it was the one that assigned it to Luke when it was European and assigned it to Alice when it was North American. And actually assigned it to two people, and one of them could choose how to handle it next, which is actually quite important. We'll come to that in a moment too, when we start talking about substitutions and reassignments. All right, so that's how we handle things like dynamic conditional assignments. That's path branching. Then we have things like start panels. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. When I want to begin a new submission, I have choices. Normally, when we start up something, we don't preload who the business entity is. So you don't have to supply it. You can choose it at the very beginning. And if you're running a single business entity, again, you don't even see this. We hide the field from you because it's single valued. But here I'm leaving it up to the user to send it or not send it, as the case may be. However, these are what we call starts, start buttons, if you would, start panels. They can be added to dashboards, or they would just appear as as part of the normal system dashboard. Well, I can preload values into a start. So if I want to start a European expense, it's already filled in and it can't be changed. And all of the defaults are already there and it's already pre-configured. And I see all three of these, but it doesn't have to be that way. Let's go back here to Designer Studio and see these start buttons. I see new expenses. I see all kinds of different things. It's possible for me to configure a dashboard for the Europeans that only contains this start button, and to configure a different dashboard for the Americans that only contains this. Notice how I've stuffed the business entity in advance. Now, because I also want open-endedness, I also have this third one where I've left the business entity open and it's up to the user to choose it. But if I do this properly, we could have one dashboard for Europe, one dashboard for North America, each of which shows a different start button, but everybody's using the same process, the same reports, compatible start button, the same logic, the same business controls, and more to the point, I only have to modify one thing when I inevitably need to change this process. It's a better way to get this done. All right. Those were start panels. Data sources. All right. Yes, of course. So here, let's jump back over here. You saw when I chose here, let's go here to a new item. If it's a new North American item, the threshold for automatic approvals is $400. If, on the other hand, it's in Europe, the threshold for automatic approvals is 500 euro. So the currency is different, the threshold is different. How do we handle that? Let's go over here and I'll show you. I'm making use, let's go to that field threshold. What I'm doing here is looking something up very quickly, and there's the formula. It's not a complicated one. I'm just looking at, I have a data source defined called business entity constants. And I'm looking up the value of name when the ID equals threshold. So I have a constant named threshold for both business entities, and the name property contains the value of the automatic threshold. Let's go see where that's configured. We're going to go here to data sources, click here. And this I just have as a fixed values list. I'm not looking up dynamic external data from anywhere. And I have created one data source called business entity constants. And since it's a fixed values list, it already has the columns established. There's ID, there's name, there's description. Exactly 3 can't be changed. Now, normally in the past when I've done webinars or other things that showed fetching external data, we just created a basic straightforward data source. But what you haven't seen before are subsidiary or subordinate data sources. So this is actually just here to act as a container or a master, a base class, if you would. The real action is taking place one level below here under business entity constants. So this is a data source, but it has a superior source, and it's earmarked for a particular business entity. And so I have a couple of different fields here that are available for me to look up. How about we do, and not so much currency, but currency code. The currencies we're using are already established, but to make them friendly looking, or to make the 3-letter code easy and obvious, it's EUR in this particular case. And business entity constant over here, same kind of deal. Let's call it currency code. We want the name to match. and the name will be USD. All right, save the whole thing. Now, what this allows me to do, I've said this one's for North America. I've said this one is for Europe. I don't need to do the if-then branching over here. I just do a query against the superior data source, and it will branch down into the correct subordinate data source and grab the right value for me. And that is how you deal with dynamic data based on different business entities. We can actually get a lot more interesting about it when we talk about currencies. In fact, I'll give you a little preview. I have here under SQL data sources, the two different, these are from values from the base currency and to conversions. So for example, if I have conversions to a baseline currency, if I want to convert things to US dollars, that's the one I use in the North American business entity. On the other hand, if I want to convert things to euros, then it will be here. So all I need to do is under conversions to baseline currency, I have different queries that return compatible results. In other words, the same column names, the same data types, different values entirely, depending on whether we're in Europe or North America. And all I have to do is query their parent, and it'll pull the right things through. In fact, I have something here where I'm converting to Canadian dollars. This is never executed. I just did this in order to establish what the three columns in the results set would be, what their names are, and what their data types are. So I had to throw in something up here, and it's just there for definition purposes. So I use that over here in a formula for calculating the home currency amount. I'm just looking up that value in this data source, conversions to the baseline currency, where the source currency is whatever's in the form, and the date of the currency is the first one that we encounter on or after the date of the transaction. We'll get in more detail, into more detail about currency conversions in just a minute or so. The main thing is it's not just for static values. It can be for dynamically fetched data. That was the thing that was important for you to see. All right. It even shows up in reporting. I can have different values show up in reports, or have different reports available to different business entities, or have them appear in different dashboards targeted at different business entities and such. So that's what business entities are for. It's a lot more than just an automatic field. It's an automatic field with security implications and path branching facilities, and basically everything can be filtered on it, including data. Multiple currencies. Oh, no, we'll come to multiple languages later. I want to talk about multiple currencies first. Let's go back over here. Now you saw me doing data source value, and I'm just multiplying it by the local amount. Now, how am I doing this? Well, we could do dynamic calls to a web service all the time to pull this off, except that virtually every web service out there that does this, eventually, if you use it too much, costs money. You also might be operating in an offline environment. You also might not necessarily have access to everything you want at every time. It also isn't necessarily performant if you're doing it on large volumes of data at a time. We realize that we kind of need to maintain offline copies of data and gather it over a period of time. And this turns out to be not especially difficult. So one of the services that can run inside of a WEBCON BPS server would be currency conversion services, and I'm looking in the wrong place. I'm supposed to be looking, is it here? Oh no, it's under schedules. Okay, so one of the schedules we have, substitution. We'll be back here in a few moments for substitution scheduling, but currency rate downloads. We're going to, realistically speaking, I'm not grabbing hour by hour type detailed data. I could really just do this once a day. In fact, I probably should. But what I am doing is downloading all conversion data from the European Central Bank, and I am apparently doing it every 3 hours. I'm starting on October the 12th of 2011. For those of you over in Europe, these are US format dates. My local culture is set up here. So we have multiple banks that you can draw from. I've chosen to use the European Central Bank's numbers for currency calculations. It matters at least on a microscopic level, but it doesn't have to be. I'm still using European Central Bank conversion numbers to look at the difference, say, between US and Canadian dollars. You can calculate that, and so we do. So this gets pulled down into a table in SQL Server, and we maintain data there, and we keep topping it up. We'll download just the change data. We don't need to grab everything every time, but we are, as long as the source of currency goes back a while, we'll grab historical information as much as we can. And now that we've got it in a table, we can do anything we want with it. And there are a couple of different approaches that we can take. I actually have a global business rule that is completely open-ended and will check to see what the source, remember, since the European Central Bank data uses the euro as its baseline currency, I basically issue one of 4 different commands. If it turns out that the source and the target are both euros, I just send the source amount back as the target amount. However, under the other conditions, I might do one of 3 different queries, depending on whether the source is euro, or the target is euro, or the source and the target are neither is the euro, in which case I'm actually doing 2 queries, or a join, basically, in order to compare. I have to compare the source to the euro and then the euro to the target. It's easy to do with a simple join, but it's not the same query in all 3 cases. So there are 4 different ways I might calculate this. This is my open-ended business rule that I use to pull this off. And what do the queries look like? They look something like this. Still not that bad. As long as you know what the names of the fields are and what they mean, it's actually pretty painless. However, the other way you can do this, if you know what the target or the source is going to be at all times, you can just create a data source that contains everything and then query the data source whenever you feel like it. So this is everything relative to the euro. In other words, Canadian dollar converted to euros, US dollars, Russian rubles, everything converted to euros. All the values over all times possible going back to 2011. Same thing. Here's the same thing, except it's US dollars, but it's from. So if I want to convert US dollars to Polish zloty or Japanese yen or what have you, it will. This is the table of all of those things. So yeah, let's click test. It's nice and performant. It's not a particularly painful thing to do, and it goes for a long period of time. Anyway, because that data is available, it's ready to be queried on a regular basis. We maintain it. You just use it. Everybody's happy. Look, if you want to call a web service every single time you want to perform a conversion, we have the ability to do that too. We're not going to stop you. But it's certainly not nearly as much fun. So that's, and if you combine that with making the query dependent on a data source that's based on business entity, it makes it really easy for me to work in euro for Europeans and dollars for Americans. It makes it actually pretty darned painless. All right. Let's go back and move on to the next thing that might vary based on different parts of the organization, which would be languages. We actually had a webinar devoted exclusively to multilingual stuff. We did that a couple of months ago. I would encourage you to take a look at it, but because it is recorded and it is on our YouTube channel. That said, we can do something, well, a small treatment of it right here. How about we do this? Kind of showed it to you already. I am requesting leave here and I am seeing everything in English. My colleague is doing the exact same thing, but everything is in French. And how do we do this? This is the workflow designer. And what I have here is, well, I have a workflow, I have form fields, and what I happen to have is anywhere there is a user-facing string, there is a table of alternate languages. So hang on a second, I am going to grab that. Actually, I'll grab it from a different place. But everywhere you see a string that other people could see, so in this particular case, it's the name of the workflow. In this particular case, it is the name of a field or a table. I still have multiple values around it. Here is where I have leave requests, plural. And that's what I wanted. You see, and I'll show you how to fix it because I have a report down here someplace with the wrong name. So here it's called leave requests. And if I look here, sure enough, I did not name it properly. Let's fix that. And it appears in a dashboard. So let's fix that too. I have this, and if I edit this, you'll see that that's the report being displayed in that view. I allow them to be changed. Here's the display name for it, but notice that we have this table, and I am able to supply multiple values for multiple languages. Anyone building multilingual websites will find this approach quite normal. There's essentially a conversion table everywhere. So for us, if there's a user-facing string that appears anywhere in a dashboard, anywhere in the designer, anywhere on a form, anywhere in the data even, we'll go ahead and make sure it adapts. So if I come back here, I just need to refresh the page, and this should now be named properly. It is very, very, very easy for us to accommodate multiple languages. You want detail? Go to the recording of that other webinar. Now I want to pivot and talk about substitutions. They're really, really important. Organizations need them, and it's pretty easy to deal with substitutions in the wonderful world of WEBCON BPS. In the WEBCON way, we start off by enabling substitutions. Let me flip back over here and show you what I'm talking about. We're over here in leave land. I actually need to come here to system settings. And the very first thing I need to do in terms of global parameters is activate substitutions. Now, the defaults are usually the right things to do anyway, so you can leave them off, or you can base them on a SQL Server database you maintain or an external data source pulling data from another place. And you can indicate whether you want substitutions to be sensitive to the hour of the day or just the date. Typically, the defaults are the right things to do. And you click this and that activates substitutions. What does that do? Among other things, it turns on this schedule of looking to see which substitution should be activated, because you can set up substitutions in advance and schedule them to turn on and turn off. We don't do that every second of every day. We do it in a nice orderly fashion. In this particular case, we do it every 3 hours. Since our schedule is based on dates as opposed to hours, I probably could get away with just doing that once a day. However, it just takes a couple of seconds, if that. So it's not doing harm by being executed every 3 hours. All right, so I activate it here. I then need to enable it in individual applications and processes. So let's take a look here at absences. Whoops, sorry, not at the application, at the process level. If I come here to leave requests and I go here to settings, you will see substitutions. Is this a process where I want to enable substitutions? Now, there's some granularity here. Let's take a look at what the choices are. When you're configuring substitutions, you get to choose this. Do I want substitutions to be possible for this process? If so, you turn that on. Do I want the task to remain accessible to the substitute after the substitution period is over? For example, I'm going away on vacation next week. While I am gone, I set up my colleague, Mike Potter, to be my substitute for every task assigned to me. What happens when I come back a week later? Should those tasks remain with Mike, or should they come back to me? The default is to have everything come back to me, but should Mike still be able to see them? Should he be able to contribute or monitor them or do other things? He was obviously involved. It might be important to keep him notified or allow him to jump in if there's a discussion or something to that effect. Remember, our workflow instances are full-blown cases. They might live for a long time. So I might want him to stay able to reach that task, so it'll still show up on his list of items. He can open it up and do what he won't have the same privileges he used to have, but he'll still be able to see it. Do I want to keep him informed? So if there are notification messages going out to me, should we CC him automatically after the substitution period has taken place? And since he knows that he's going to be the substitute next week, if there's an alert for this process this week, should we proactively send him notification messages? He can't act on them until next week, but should we let him know in advance? Now, yeah, you might say this is a whole lot to keep track of, but I guarantee you everywhere I've ever worked wound up asking for one of these kinds of options. Because in a realistic, real-world organization with any complexity, letting people know what's going on before or after they were playing an active role in it happens all the time. So you turn that on, you save the process, and now it's possible for us to assign substitutes for this task. If you don't enable substitutions, it won't be, substitutions are still possible, but they won't apply here. They won't matter here. Now, how do you turn on substitutions on an active basis? Let's go back here to the beginning of this portal. In fact, here, I'll do it over here. Doesn't really matter which application I'm in. In fact, I'll go back to the top level of this. This icon up here, where normally you see your name, you can log in, log out, change the language or the theme or so on. But there's a solution or an item here called substitutions. If I know, and I want to do this manually, that I'm going to be gone next week, I'll just come here to substitutions. And if I have privileges to act on behalf of other people, for example, if I'm a manager with direct reports, I can always do substitutions on their behalf. But I'm going to do this for me. And what I'm going to say is I will be replaced. And by the way, in case you were curious, if I'm doing it on behalf of someone else, I have to type that in. Still make it me. Okay. The person is going to substitute for me. How about I say that's going to be this guy named Horace. Horace is going to start substituting for me on the 3rd of August, and he will stop substituting for me after the 7th. By default, I'm going to have him cover all of my applications. Well, I'm going to have him do all of them. These are the applications that allow for substitutions. I have many more applications than this, but these are the ones that allow for substitutions. And by default, I'll say he's my substitute for everything. But you know what? Horace is located in North America. I only want Horace to cover any of my, it doesn't matter what the process is. If the business entity, the process is, or the instance is running in is North America, it's going to go to Horace. On the other hand, I want Rhoda. I want Rhoda to cover the same stuff during the same time period, again, in all applications, but Rhoda's based in Europe. So again, substitutions are sensitive to business entities. It's pretty great. In fact, you know something, if I want to come back here, by default, yeah, no, I like this as is, but what I'm also going to do is this, one more substitution. I am going to have, let's see, in North America, who else? Oh yeah, Justin. Okay, just in case is going to stand in for me, again, same period, but only for the time and expenses thing. Horace is fine for everything, but for approving time and expenses, that's really something, it makes more sense to have Justin review that. He controls our department's budget, or I have him do that. So he's going to deal only in this application, and I can refine it process by process if I wish to do so. And Justin only covers North America, so I'm just going to have him do that. Okay, so I'm going to be gone for a week. Horace covers everything in North America except for expense reports. That'll be Justin. Rhoda covers everything in Europe. That's it. That's all I have to do. It's just going to automatically, suddenly on Monday morning, Rhoda and Horace and Justin are going to suddenly see extra tasks that they didn't have previously. It's basically all there is to it. And then at the end of the week, like right after Friday, those tasks, unless they've been instructed to linger, unless I'm checked that checkbox, they'll vanish after that time and they'll return to me. If that checkbox from before, which is to leave them with privileges, where was it? Nope, not there. Here. If that's checked, they'll still see it in their tasks list, but it'll be marked as a CC task after I come back. That's all there is to it in terms of substitutions. Well, that's not entirely true. We have actions in workflows that allow you to deal with substitutions and therefore make them part of a new business process. Check this out. I happen to have, oh, this is a leave request workflow, right? Let's look at the workflow designer. And someone is preparing a request for time off, and then it gets reviewed by a manager, and then it gets reviewed by a reviewer. So far, so good. And then if it gets approved, a number of it's going to wind up in the approved state. But you know something? If it gets approved, many things must happen. They're right here underneath this. So it turns out 6 things will happen along that approval path. The one I'm most interested interested in is setting up a substitution. And that's an action that you can call. You can add one or remove one. I'm going to stick with add one. And if I come here to configure, it's pretty straightforward. Much like assigning a task, you choose who's going to be the assignee and who substitute from to. In this particular case, it's the employee. That's a field in the form. It could have been a dynamically chosen role, which is the author of the request, I suppose, but I have it as a form in the field, so I'm using that. And task substitute is also a form in the field, so we're deferring to that. And here's the start date and the end date. I'm even keeping a copy of the substitution entry as a field in the form because I might come back to it later to remove it. In fact, if I need to remove the substitution because someone decided not to take the time off after all, that is exactly what saving the ID was for. I canceled the substitution, and if I'm going to cancel a substitution, everything is disabled. I just need to supply the ID for it. It is literally that simple. In fact, it's literally that simple, but we can make it far more interesting than that. Here's a slightly more elaborate version of the same workflow. Different process, same fundamental functionality. And in this particular case, when I create the substitution, we go all out. It's not a simple replacement. It's an advanced replacement because we're doing SQL queries to determine not only the start and end date, but we're talking about complex queries to determine who the assignee is. Why? Actually, let's expand this. It's two requests. One is for the default substitute, and the second one is for process-specific substitutes. And once you know the data schema, it's not particularly difficult to follow this. I don't expect anyone to master this on day one. This is, you either copy this from a template or you you wait until you know a little bit more about this. But it's pretty easy to modify, among other things. But this is really a two-part query. One is the default, and the second one is process-specific substitutions. By the way, you don't need to have a default. If you only have a process-specific substitution, only that process will receive substitutes. There won't be a default. All right, that's pretty much it. So you can control it as part of a normal absence approval process if you wish to do so. In summary, when you take support for business entities and you add to that conditional data based on business entities and conditional permissions and conditional currencies and conditional languages and conditional task assignees and substitutions, and you couple that with the fact that everything can be changed at any time and it takes effect instantly, well, that sums up to a far better way to workflow, the WEBCON way. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. We really do appreciate it. And if you'd like more information about WEBCON BPS or anything else WEBCON-wise, go to www.webcon.com. Have a great rest of your evening, afternoon, or morning. Bye now.